this issue matters to us at Tzedek DC. Tzedek is this great word from the Bible, from the Torah, meaning justice. And so our goal has been to address the fact that there are these massive disparities throughout the country, but specifically in DC and in the DC area in terms of access to justice, to the civil justice system, and in terms of access to the economic system. And that's something that capital area asset builders and others have been such leaders on locally. How do we bridge these gaps that draw from centuries of structural racism in our country, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, in the District of Columbia and elsewhere? And so we come at this work from the viewpoint of, in the District of Columbia, the average white family has a net worth that's 8,100% greater than the average African American family, and almost that much greater than the mean Latina family. And this is not a coincidence. This is the result of conscious government policy for decades and choices that leadership made over years. And so we now look at ways to make the policy smarter, better, fairer, and make sure that people can tap into their full rights to engage and be on that ladder of social and economic mobility. And I think the driver's license issue has caught fire in this country in the wake of Ferguson, Missouri, and what we saw, as Joseph and others have eloquently talked about. Ferguson highlighted, and the Washington Post then spoke about 7 million Americans had lost their driver's license from unpaid debt. And we saw that state and local governments were setting up policies to balance the books on the backs of our low-income community members.
Right.
And I think that's really driven some of the energy around driver's license reform. And I know, Alfonso and Elizabeth, that you've been leaders on this issue in Virginia. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
First off, I mean, we've been trying to address criminal justice reform and the school to prison pipeline for the last several years. 3 years ago, I put in legislation to actually ban the suspension of driver's licenses for people who have paid their debt to society. And they're being told after they paid their debt to society, well, you can't get your driver's license back until you've paid all of your court fees and fines. What does that mean? That means that 600,000 people in Virginia, more than 600,000, right, have had their driver's license suspended. So what do you do in that situation when you actually have to make a hard decision? Do you actually not drive, not be able to go to work, not be able to take your kids to school, not be able to go to a doctor's office, and then raise the money to pay off your court fees and fines? Or do you run the risk of driving and then potentially get another violation, maybe a worse violation because you're driving without a license? The fact is that, and I've said this before on the floor with you, Elizabeth, we should never be criminalizing poverty, especially in the Virginia State Code. It's just not who we should be. It's not the right way to go for the Commonwealth. I'm so incredibly happy that just a couple months ago we were able to finally ban that practice, and my legislation was included during our reconvene session. We were able to get it addressed in the budget, and so finally this is something that's being done and fixed and rectified. But things like this are small examples that have significant problems for people who don't have the means of others. And so there are dozens of these, hundreds of these kinds of instances where institutional ways of doing things have had a negative impact, significant negative impact on populations that are experiencing poverty. And as we've seen, Elizabeth, it's, and as you and I've talked about, it's exponentially more often happening in communities of color, like the Latino community, the African American community.
Yeah. It's important to know that this law is going to be coming into effect July 1st. And yes, it's a great victory that...
For folks listening at home, what does the law do?
So what it does is will not allow Virginians who owe court fees to have their driver's license suspended.
That's
but they will reinstate the driver's license, but they still owe the money.
Right.
And I want to make that message clear, because I've got numerous phone calls where my constituents ask me about it. Do I still have to pay my debt?
Yes.
How they're going to write off my debt? And that's not what the law does. You know, what the law does is you won't have your license suspended, but you still owe that money to the government, to the local government, the state government, whatever fee that you have. But I think criminal justice reform has more things to do. I spent a lot of time in the court as a child advocate for CASA, and I've seen how children of color have been, punished harder than white kids. And you've seen, like, in Virginia, you can send a 14-year-old to an adult prison. And when you look at the demographics and look at the numbers, it's children of color who cannot afford to have representation. But in Virginia also, a minor could waive their Miranda rights. And I can think about my children, teenagers, I have 4 of them, and they don't want any help. They don't want to know anything. And sometimes it's ignorance, what put them in a system where they have to go to prison and then end up their life in prison. So there is, still so much change to do in reform as well. And it's important that this year we have elections in November and that people get informed about people who look like us, and they can learn about those candidates that really believe in criminal justice reform. They are fighting to protect communities like ours.
Right.
And I think when it's a common theme that when we take one step back and focus on why licenses are being suspended, it's really the intersection of economic justice, social justice, and the racial wealth gap. In May of 2018, the Washington Post published that great report where they found at least 7 million driver's licenses had been suspended throughout the U.S. And predominantly they were low-income communities of color. So we cannot just treat this as a separate incident, right? It is really looking at how is poverty being criminalized, how is also the ethnic minority being implemented vis-a-vis the racial wealth gap. And here what's extremely relevant is to focus that we're really talking about minor offenses. We're not talking about major criminal activity. So we're talking about somebody who might be suffering from cancer, who is recovering at a hospital, who's not able to pay for a $25 ticket, which within a month might become $50, within 4 months might become $200. And suddenly that initial $25 de minimis situation becomes a life-altering situation. So it's not only the suspension of a driver's license. So Alfonso is referring to how it impacts. In this car-driven society of ours, we need the ability to transport ourselves to make money, to go to school, to do basic necessities. But it also impacts other economic examples, such as the inability to process official documentation, the inability to open bank accounts, the inability to have access to fair credit. So it's not only this key driver's license, right? But it's what role it plays, what crucial role it plays in simply being able to live throughout the U.S.
Right, and to piggyback on that, there's a long line of issues that we need to address in terms of criminal justice reform in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Just a couple of years, like this past year, we were able to actually finally increase the felony threshold. Guess what it was? Just until till last session, $200. So if you're a 19-year-old kid and you steal someone's iPhone, you have a felony conviction. So what does that mean in Virginia? Well, the way we've been draconian in how we've addressed criminal justice issues over the last 2 decades, that affects everything. Your ability to get financial freedom, your ability to, vote, your ability to, you have this felony conviction hanging over your head and seriously limiting your options for decades, for your entire life, because of something silly you did as a teenager. And so $500 is actually still too low.
Still one of the lowest
in the country.
But what it originates people to be in that situation. We still live in a country which is one of the wealthiest in the world, where the minimum wage is $7.25. So many people actually have to have 2 jobs or 3 jobs to make ends meet, and that is lack of supervision on their children. It's just having the burden to bring food to the table and pay rent, and they are not able to afford and they are stressed. I mean, I'm an immigrant, so I've been there. I know exactly how it feels. I was just blessed enough not to be in that type of problem. But when I see people who look like me and that I share stories with, that I now represent, it hurts me. How we have not been able to evolve. What is this rejection of not increase the minimum wage, of maybe not provide paid sick family leave to Virginians?
Right.
Like we have states like Maryland, Washington DC, they provide paid sick leave to individuals. In Virginia, when you are, it's at will estate, and you work for a private organization, you are at the employer's will. So people do not have access to go to preventive care. They have to use their vacation time to go to the doctor, or they just don't go to the doctor until they are really ill. And then what happens is they die. We spend more money in health insurance. We were able to also pass Medicaid expansion.
Yes.
And now we have at least enrolled 257,000 individuals in Virginia who live under poverty and were lacking health insurance. I think that is the first step, but there's still too much to do.
Well, and piggyback on that, just in Arlington, just in South Arlington, Arlington County is one of the most well-educated communities in the world, really, one of the wealthiest communities in the world, not just in the United States. Of the 100 House of Delegates districts, the fourth highest concentration of people who will benefit from Medicaid expansion is the 49th House Delegates district that I represent in South Arlington. What does it say that every month at the Arlington Free Clinic you have a line of people 150 deep trying for 30 spots to get free health care each month, still, in Arlington? And the fact that there are 5,600 of our neighbors and friends who would benefit from Medicaid expansion. What you're dealing with here, I mean, it's systemic. It's a part of, like, the restoration of rights. Restoration of rights fight we've been going through for the last several years, right? It was put in place as an anti-African American initiative at the turn of the century to take away the voting rights of African Americans during, the height of the segregationist era in Virginia. 40 states, let me repeat that, 40 states have automatic restoration of rights for voting in America. Why are we unique that we need to, have someone go and get the governor to sign off after you have a felony conviction, where you need the governor's approval before you can actually get your voting rights back? That makes no sense to me whatsoever. And these...
So you're really talking about the ability to participate in the democratic system, right? And that's what's really so interesting about this key topic, because the overarching theme is being able and being capable of participating in basic systems, whether it's the financial system, the democratic system, the economic system. Elizabeth, you were referring to being an immigrant. When we focus on driver's licenses, of course, we do not have that ability in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but there are a lot more progressive jurisdictions throughout the U.S. Where I've resided most of my life in California, and I was very proud that in California, anybody who's a resident of California is able to get a legal, official driver's license. Unfortunately, that is about to cease to be a great right, because now with the federal Real ID initiative, it has to be a federal government approved entity. But the inability to have access to an official document, that right away prevents somebody from participating in basic systems. Yep. So by having a $25 parking fine eventually grow into a financial burden that prevents the state from reauthorizing a driver's license, that right away keeps that individual away from achieving any facet of the American dream. Forget about home ownership. Forget about the ability of their children to apply for FAFSA, for financial aid. So there's so many different components that have nothing to do with the driver's license role, but have everything to do that you have to start somewhere. So one of the areas where Ariel and I focus on is the role that debt plays in enabling or preventing somebody in the U.S., regardless of the immigration status, to proactively participate in the economic system. So we're looking into the intersection of debt relief. We're not talking about just giving money away, right? Everybody has to have skin in the game. Financial knowledge, economic knowledge, but also economic participation. But what is that intersection between debt relief and long-term societal investment? So we have to be looking for solutions that really bring everybody to the table. And one of the very basic approaches that I've started to develop with new partners is pay up now or pay up later. Because we either need to be investing in the long-term sustainability of any kind of a socioeconomic program, or we have to be dealing the consequences, right? Because one of the areas that when we're very passionate and energetic about one key component is that we, or at least I, let me speak on my behalf, I believe that others understand why it's important. I believe that others are also passionate when I have to realize that not everybody is coming from the same perspective. So I need to be addressing why is it important to other members of society who might not be like-minded. And when we start looking at the perspective from the other side and how that other side needs to realize that they too will be impacted if we have somebody driving on 95 without a driver's license, without insurance. At that point, if I did not believe that you should have that driver's license, immediately I say, well, what about if you hit me when I'm driving down 95? So we need to be looking at the selfish perspective, and then it's a true coalition building approach.
Well, and I love that, and I love your point about the license as almost a ticket to participation in the financial and in other official forms of our society and our democracy. I think two examples come to mind. To Joseph's point about places where we see the cost of the choice that we've made so far. Number one, we've arrested thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans in the District of Columbia and Virginia and throughout the country for the offense of driving without a license. When the reason they didn't have a license was because they couldn't get the money to pay the fee. And that has been our criminalization of poverty, just one very prominent example. But when we arrest folks for that, now we've introduced thousands and thousands of our community members into the criminal justice system. And all the costs to their future, be it voting, be it access, even with the ban the box reforms, access to future employment, the stigma, the physical and psychological harm.
Just the cost of incarceration.
And the cost of incarceration, and just the opportunity cost, where we believe that this is a horrible use of law enforcement resources, which should be focused on spending time making all of our families safer rather than figuring out who has a license and is driving. The second piece where this really comes up is that in the district, and I confess I don't know how this works in Virginia, I'll be curious to learn in Maryland and elsewhere, in the district, when you have an unpaid debt that's more than $100 to the DC government, you cannot get a professional license, and you cannot get a professional license renewed. That means when you want to be a barber, when you want to be a pharmacy tech, your license will be denied, or if you have a license, when you go to renew it at the end of its expiration, that application will be denied, and you cannot engage in your profession. You cannot take advantage.
As they call it.
It is. I have to put the term clean hands in rabbit bunny ears, because clean hands is the name of the law, but it's a horrible misnomer of a law, because it says that you have moral culpability for owing $101. When we know, for all the reasons that we talked about earlier on in the show, there are many situations where there's no moral culpability for a mother of five, and we actually have this client who is working 3 jobs, who is getting her kids through school, who is supporting a parent, and who's dealing with multiple generations of health issues. There's not moral culpability when she falls behind on a bill, when the grandmother in the household suddenly has a medical crisis and requires time and money. And yet we say she doesn't have clean hands, and moreover, she cannot engage in the profession and in her, what she has decided is her highest and best use. And in the district, we are a very highly regulated place. 31 of our 62 professions require this professional license. And so one of the things that's interesting about this is that not only have the sort of the traditional progressive groups, but places like the Institute for Justice, which is based here in Virginia, have come together with folks traditionally on the left and said, these kinds of rules where the government's choice, where the government is being a really aggressive debt collector and harming people's financial futures, these kinds of rules needs to be changed as a basic way of how are we going to empower families to get stability and to get on that ladder, which has been available to some Americans for a long time, and now as we start to see this momentum for immigrant families, for more from our communities of color, to expand those opportunities.
What would you guys say the biggest negative drivers are in terms of areas where you're seeing this lack of equity, where you're seeing this demonization of poverty, that need to be fixed? Like, are there 4 or 5 of larger issues that should be addressed before the others?
Well, you certainly have
it's licensure,
licensure
not driver's
is a big
licenses,
one.
but also job licenses.
Abuses by the private debt collection industry, both in the lending
Payday lending.
terms and in the way that the debt collection industry has become a mass lawsuit factory, and those lawsuits are disproportionately targeted. We know this from study after study, disproportionately targeted even when you control for income against our communities of color. You pair that with 2 other really difficult things. Number one, the legacy of racist policies, which has left our communities of color with far less wealth. And number 2, the immigration policies that the Trump administration has chosen to engage in which ICE, immigration agents, show up in the courthouse. That has chilled our immigrant community from participating in civil cases. And it means that the default judgments have skyrocketed. Why does that matter? Those judgments go on to people's permanent records and make it hard for them to get approval for their future rental housing applications, or in many cases to get approval for a job.
I would say it's really the economic interdependency of how there are multiple systems that are dependent on information provided by another system. So point in case is, we know that in the United States, we have one of the very few societies throughout the world where having access to credit is almost the same as having access to cash. So when a $25 bill goes unpaid, it doubles, quadruples, and so forth. Now that shows up, as you were indicating, in somebody's credit history, and their credit score is shattered. It is extremely difficult to significantly improve somebody's credit score. It is very easy to diminish within a second somebody's credit score. So right away, because we are, and I love that you mentioned law enforcement, because I think something that we need to indicate is that we are not talking about giving somebody a free ticket, right? It's about prioritizing how we spent our scarce resources when it comes to law enforcement, when it comes to social justice. So if we are spending a lot of time or a lot of laws on focusing on criminalizing poverty, right away we're setting up everybody for failure. And when I say everybody, it's not only those impacted, because I benefit when somebody's able to purchase a home. They pay real estate taxes. I benefit when somebody's able to launch a micro enterprise. If somebody is unable to launch a barbershop, that person will not be paying license taxes, will not be paying business taxes, will not be hiring new people. So again, I come from the perspective of how is society overall impacted, and that's where we need to have better local solutions, since we know that at the national level, given the current situation, we're not going to advance too much. But that's where I really admire work that Delegates Guzmán and Lopez focus on, because the local solutions can lead the way, and that is where we as a Commonwealth of Virginia need to do a better job.
Absolutely.
I had a bill I had a bill last year, and when you talk about the unintended consequences of the immigration policies, there was a report that came out in the first 8 months of 2017, first 8 months of the Trump administration, that the percentage of domestic violence cases in South Arlington, specifically the Latino and New American communities, had gone down 75%. The number of sexual violence reports had gone down 85%. Was that because it wasn't happening? No, it was because people were too scared to actually report. In the first 8 months of 2017, anything to the local police because they were scared that if they did, they themselves or a loved one would get caught up in the ICE detention process. And so, and then to make it worse, we have community policing efforts that have been in place for decades, and they're very, very good. But if we're not having every community feeling safe to speak to the police, then everyone in the community is less safe, because what's happening is bad actors, folks are going to be preying on these communities, knowing full well that they are too scared to report to the police. And so when you're talking about the unintended consequences of these things, it's not just in terms of financial issues, it's also in terms of public safety. And so when that legislation I put in last year, it didn't pass because of the nature of the majority in the House of Delegates, as you know. But we'll be putting it in next year, and hopefully we'll be getting it passed. I cut you off, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. We're talking about children earlier, and that reminded me that this year during this legislative session, I had a child who came to my office with her parents, and she was in tears because their parents didn't have a driver's license, and she missed the bus. And she called her parents because she wanted to be driven to go to school. And her father told her, please do not do that. We can only drive to go to work. We cannot drive anywhere else because my driver's license is suspended. So this is how it trickles down to children, and how this stress comes and hurts the most vulnerable community. And it's disappointing that we were not able to take action before. And going back to the children for undocumented communities like Maryland, you refer California, but Maryland, Washington DC are already doing it. And it's a matter of safety. It's not about, because as politicians we're usually attacked when we want to fight to provide driver's license to undocumented immigrants. And the attack is we're going to allow these people so they could vote, so they can buy alcohol, so they could buy a gun. And that is not true. What we want is one safe communities. Because as you mentioned, if we get into an accident with individuals that do not have a driver's license and do not have insurance, who's going to pay for it? People who have insurance, who have driver's license, and the consequence is our rates go up. Our risk to have an accident is higher, and our rates are higher. And if we transfer that to a financial, for me, it's very important. If we were to charge $100 for driver's license in Virginia, there is an estimate. The last time I talked to the commissioner of the Department of Motor and Vehicles, there are about 260,000 Virginians without driver's license. So if we transfer that, put 100 next to it, we could be making $26 million to bring back to Virginia. And that is just to the state. And we're not talking about local property taxes that could go to Arlington, Alexandria, Fairfax, many localities.
And driver's insurance.
And driver's insurance as well. We have more businesses that could sell more insurance. So it's just, in any way you see it, it's a win situation.
Well, I think that's such a powerful story, and it reminds me of a story we saw going the other way, which was there was during the legislative hearing in the district on this issue. A Ward 8 constituent came in and shared her story, which was that she had fallen behind on paying her tickets. Her license had been taken away. And a few days later, her mother called and said, I'm being airlifted. I've had this massive coronary, and they're airlifting me to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And she was in tears telling the story to the members of the council on the dais, because she was recalling sitting in her car, trying to decide whether to turn the ignition, and facing the choice of whether to not be able to be with her mother, who was on her way to the hospital in a very extreme situation, or taking that risk of driving through the DC, driving through Maryland, and knowing that this might lead to an arrest and all of the problems. And she eventually made the choice that many society members, let's be candid, reasonably make, which was, I need to do life. I need to have the necessities of life that Joseph referred to, and I need to go see my mother. And I think, so you really do see it with families needing to be with their children on basic day-to-day life necessities, needing to be with seniors and grandparents or parents who are in need of sort of that basic family support. And so this has been an opportunity at the state and local level to change what has been a totally counterproductive policy. And I'm not sure it was intended to be punitive at the beginning, as I think there were some legislators decades ago who said, well, we want to make sure that people pay and people comply. And then eventually the rationale became, well, this seems to be bringing a lot of money. And so we saw in the District of Columbia that there was quite an interest in generating revenue through the DMV and the criminal justice process. And that, I think, for everyone starts to set off red flags. When the criminal justice process, we were talking, I think, before the show started, a little bit about the government as using civil forfeiture and other means to extract wealth through the criminal justice process. And when that starts happening, you have all sorts of opportunities for messed up incentives, right? And so I think this is one example, certainly not the only example, but it's a big major victory in the Commonwealth, and we're getting there in the district of turning this policy around and saying this was something that maybe wasn't so well thought through, and now that we've seen what's happening in Ferguson, Missouri, now that we've seen the trend documented, there are still 40 plus states that suspend licenses for unpaid debts, but that number is going down every single week. It's really remarkable, and it's exciting that in the district and in Virginia, and now thanks to Brian Frost, there's a little bit of momentum in Maryland. So the DMV is starting to be able to be at the forefront of this wave of change, something that's exciting, and that you and your colleagues have played such a major role in this fiscal year 20 budget provision, being able to push through, in which we know there has been some pushback from legislators who have said let's not make this too easy for people to have access to their driver's license.
Yeah, it took us 3 years to get it done.
So there's a lot more to be done, right? But what's extremely important is to start having very intentional conversations on who are the impacted individuals. And when we immediately realize that significantly we are talking about low income, predominantly communities of color, that's where immediately we need to have an open conversation on racism. You're referring to historical racist policies that continue to be in place. And it is not until we have that true American dialogue on racism and how to shut it down where we can be very intentional and strategic on then say, these are some of the laws that are either outrageous or these are some of the law enforcement components where we do not really need to be prioritizing at this point.
Yeah, I do,
exactly right.
And I do want to highlight a note of optimism, which is to say I think the private sector, which was either a neutral or maybe not such a helpful actor for so long, the private sector is now getting to a positive place here. And so you have another number of financial institutions, a number of foundations that work in the DMV, the Meyer Foundation and others, who have said very self-consciously, said we need to have this conversation and these policies need to change. And we are going to take some significant resources and apply those resources to encourage changing the structures that have led to these bad outcomes. And I don't know if we want to speak to the role of the private sector in sort of helping to respond to some of these issues, but I'm encouraged that we're starting to see not just sort of the traditional progressive left, but the business community saying, wait a minute, we have an interest in customers
Absolutely.
who can get to work, in people who have access to financial empowerment. And that's something that, Joseph, I don't know if you want to speak to, but I think it's something we've seen in the CAB work.
It's really about the ability to achieve financial freedom, and Alfonso referred to that. And financial freedom means different things from different people, right? So, Elizabeth, my wife and I are proud naturalized U.S. citizens, and one of the areas that is being considered right now is during the naturalization process and during the permanent residency process and even during the asylum process, asking the petitioner about their credit score and looking into their credit history. So again, we're talking about one simple component, if I may put it this way, that has significant ripple down effect that would prevent somebody who has, let's say, lived an exemplary life throughout their time in the U.S., it would prevent them from actually becoming a U.S. citizen, thus preventing them from democratically participating in society and preventing them from achieving other goals. So
It's as if you read our comments to DHS on the matter.
So again, I'm optimistic that we are beginning to have the conversation, but there is so much more work to be done.
Yes, there is.